Hello and welcome back, and that's right, today I'm going to guide you through the WD Colors range of SSDs. I would say of all of the brands that I talk about here on the channel, when it comes to presentation and marketing, particularly when it comes to storage media, very few brands are kind of got a handle on things early doors when it came to presenting their ranges and their portfolio like Western Digital have for the most part. We'll get onto that later on. The way they presented a lot of their SSDs very early on when it came to the commercial side of things was kind of made particularly successful thanks to their colours spectrum. It is ultimately how they picked different colours to, apply to different areas of the industry. And by the industry, I just mean everything: commercial, business, surveillance, NAS, gaming. And thanks to that, it means that an end user does not need to know all of the literally thousands or tens of thousands of part numbers that have accrued over time to narrow down the right SSD for their needs. Now, I've done a video like this every 18 to 24 months because ranges change. Different models arrive and old models disappear. And I have done a video on WD Colors range of SSDs before. But I've got to say, the escalation and the number of SSDs that have evolved in the WD Colors range of SSDs has resulted in me having to make this video a lot earlier than I would have liked to, if I'm perfectly honest with you. Now, that is to their credit, to be fair, because all of the SSDs that have been added are all bangers, and there's not really any duffers, and the duffers that were there the last time are actually gone now. So on the one hand, I'm quite chuffed to make a video where I get to talk about very, very good SSDs, but at the same time, this is a long video, so strap in, get a coffee, and use the chapters on the bottom. I've done that direction. I think it's going to be that way when you watch this, but use the chapters at the bottom if you want to skip ahead to different SSDs and purposes. But before we break down into the individual groups, when we go into each group and the key SSDs amongst them, a few honourable mentions, because it is worth highlighting, as I said earlier on, that although WD got ahead of most of the other brands out there to create a far more relatable and understandable portfolio, it's not completely inclusive. And although I'm going to cover the WD Colors range of SSDs, that is not the only SSDs they provide. There's actually quite a large number of SSDs outside of the paddock, because WD is actually created and manages several different subdivisions as well. Things like SanDisk, the difference between WD and Western Digital, and UltraStar and things like that. So the SSDs that are not going to be included in this guide, but are still honourable mentions, are as follows. Firstly, the PC series, and I don't mean PC like a standard personal computer. I mean the PCSA, the PC. I think it's called the PC SATA, PCSA, PCSN. These are SSDs that are a lot more based on energy efficiency, but domestic deployment with a decent kind of durability. So low energy, high performance there, and that's the PCSA. And they come normally on M2s. There's an NVMe version of that, the PC DC, and on top of that, you've got the UltraStar DC series of SSDs arriving in U.2 NVMe with things like FIPS and SSD encryption on board. They're not going to be in this. Next up, you've got things like the SanDisk Extreme, because I'm focusing on the WD Colors, but it is worth highlighting that the kind of connected company SanDisk there has their own triple tier range of SSDs in the SanDisk Extreme, the SanDisk Ultra, and the SanDisk Plus, and the highest to the lowest tier there. Then you've got the WD Black PCIe SSD, because although we're going to talk about WD Black later on, it's worth highlighting that there is another WD Black SSD that's not going to make this cut, and it's a PCIe card that's loaded on general PCIe with enhanced capacity there and performance. And finally, the UltraStar DC-ZN series, the SN640 and the SN840 series, all kind of lumped in together. All of these are either too enterprise and therefore not part of the commercial colour spectrum there, or they are kind of made to order, and they have such a specific focus and design, or our OEM type drives, that I didn't want to include them in our WD Colors buyer's guide. But those are our honourable mentions. Let's crack on with the SSDs. Now, we have a lot to be getting on with today, and of course there's always going to be disclaimers, so straight away All of the SSDs I talk about today and their pricing is correct as of October 2022. So SSDs that are available and the prices that I'm giving you in pounds and dollars, these are for up to date up to that period, around about the 12th of October, I believe, the date of recording. Another thing I'll say is when I give you a performance benchmark, I am giving you the highest performance for each of the SSD models, but bear in mind those models have individual capacities. So if there is a 1 TB all the way up to a 4 TB, I'm giving you the performance of the 4 TB model. But bear in mind that smaller capacities will often give slightly lower performance because of the distribution of things like NAND on the chip and memory allocation and more. Next up, unless I say otherwise, these SSDs have all got 5 years of warranty. There's only a few exceptions where it is less than 5 years of warranty. Next up, much like performance, if I mention TBW or terabytes written, that is the total amount of capacity this SSD is designed to have written to it in its 5-year warranty lifespan there. And whenever you hear that number, I'm going to give you the maximum terabyte written. But remember, that number is based on the highest capacity. So for example, if I give you a TBW of 3000, that is most likely going to be applying to a 2 or 4 TB drive based on the capacity. If you go for the smaller drives, it scales accordingly. Next up, PCIe generations. Unless I say otherwise, assume they are PCIe Gen 3. There's only a couple of exceptions to that rule when it comes to PCIe, and that is the bandwidth allocated between the drive and the motherboard there. And newer generation SSDs like PS5 run on PCIe Gen 4, and the majority of PCs that people utilize day to day are still running PCIe Gen 3. Only PCs in the last 18 months or so can you comfortably assume you have higher than PCIe Gen 3. So it goes for SATA. All of these are SATA 3, so in other words 6 gigabits per second. And finally, when it comes to things like the controller and the NAND on board, assume that the controller is an in-house WD like the NVMe or the SanDisk or the WD Black G2, or assume that the NAND, that's the chips on board, that's where the data lives, is going to be 3D TLC NAND. There's only a few examples when that is not the case, so just assume otherwise. But apart from that, let's crack on with our first entry, the WD Black series. Now, the WD Black series currently arrives in 4 different versions of SSD. All of them are M.2. There are no longer any SATA SSDs. Now, the WD Black series is predominantly for the gamers, and again, that can be PC gamers, it can be PS5 gamers, it can be a varied degree, even Mac users as well. If you're a gamer and you're looking at WD drives, pretty much ignore everything apart from WD Black. But even within the WD Black series of drives, there are subdivisions there. Probably the oldest one of the current generation available is the WD SN750, otherwise known as the 750E. In other versions that are out there, but you're not really going to find that anymore. You may have seen these online bundled as like the Call of Duty drive, or generally there's promotions that knock around with SSD, but we're doing WD and games developers. Now, these arrive, this older PCIe Gen 3 SSD arrives in between 250 gig and 2 terabytes. The Gen 3 SSD with a terabytes written performance, so that's its durability, at 1200 terabytes written, which is about 0.3 drive writes per day there. Now, in the UK, it knocks around for about 49 nicker, and on the largest capacity up to £208 in dollars, it's $59 up to $229. Now, when it comes to performance, I'm pleased to say that because it's a Gen 3 NVMe, you're still getting decent numbers. At maximum capacity, you're looking at 3,400 megabytes per second read and 3,000 megabytes per second write, and that is sequential performance as well. So that is block data, and you'll hear that a lot throughout this video. In terms of IOPS, that is the smallest amount of data randomly selected all over the drives, otherwise known as, in this case, 4K random, so get ready to hear that a lot in the video. It is 515,000 read IOPS over 560,000 write IOPS. So again, great performance there from their SSD, but that is still old gen. Now, in the years since that SSD came to market, Gen 4 arrived in M2 Gen 4. Now, these are the SSDs that you're going to be far more familiar with these days. I reckon the SN750 series I just discussed doesn't have a vast amount of time left on it. And the next 3 SSDs are all Gen 4. And I'm going to go from the lowest to the highest, although weirdly, they haven't all arrived on the scene in that order. Now, arriving in mid-2022 was the SN7700. Now, this arrives in between 250 gig and 2 TB. Again, Gen 4, this is a 1200 terabyte written SSD at the largest capacity. And what makes this one stand out is that although it's PCIe Gen 4 and gives some great performance that overshadows the one before it, it's worth remembering that this SSD is DRAM-less. It requires HMB, host memory buffer. It relies on the host system to spare a little bit of cache to the drive to get the job done. So it can run a little hot, and it certainly doesn't compare as favourably as it does to the other WDs in this list coming soon. But knocking around for between £52 and £196 in the UK, or $54 to $269 over in the US. It is very affordable compared to the other SSDs we're going to talk about, and the performance isn't bad. 5,100 megabytes per second sequential read over 4,900 megabytes per second sequential write. These are still good numbers, although compared with a lot of current generation Gen 4 SSDs, it's a little lower than you might like. And in terms of IOPS, it's 740,000 over 800,000. So again, decent enough numbers when you're coming off of the Gen 3. But when you look at what Gen 4 is capable of, what you can hear in a moment, you can see why this particular SSD lives in the middle in a weird place. It's designed for a lot more energy efficient operations because of that DRAM-less design. It's also more cost effective. But bear in mind, it doesn't live up to sustained 24/7 use like the others. Now, let's get serious, because now we're going to talk about the SN850 and the SN850X. Let's get the SN850 first, that arrived at the end of 2020. This is their, or was at least, their premium Gen 4 SSD. It's also the SSD that is PS4 supported and PS5 verified and supported. They've got the official license, delivery boxing, the works as an optional heatsink. But the SN850 is the one that most of you have probably heard about in this series. So it's also regularly on offer. So although I'm giving you some prices now from WD's own website, bear in mind you can definitely pick up this SSD for a bargain. Arriving between 1 TB, there used to be a 500 gig model that's kind of disappeared now. Between 1 TB and 2 TB, this Gen 4 SSD arriving with 1200 TBW at its largest capacity, knocks around, again, you can get a discount, but at the moment it is between £75 and £118, depending on the capacity you go for in the UK, and $179 to $334 US. Remember, during all of these prices, that with the pounds we've tried to factor in the tax, but when it comes to the US, we know there are kind of fluid tax rules there, so you should see a disclaimer there on the description, so bear that in mind. But ultimately, when it comes to performance, this was when the WD Black SN850 was the first time we saw really aggressive, impressive performance. So this was things like the sequential read being 7,000. It was the first SSD on the market to crack 7,000 megabytes per second. Huge when you think about that first WD Black at 3,400. And that was with a sequential read of 5,100 megabytes per second there. Now translate that into IOPS. That was 1 million IOPS over 720. 720,000, I should say. So again, huge numbers there. And for the 2 years it was at the top of the WD pile there, it was unsurpassable for a long time. Although it was only towards 2022 where we started to see a lot more credible alternatives out there, which is what brought WD to roll out the SN850X. Now this arrived in autumn 2022, and this SSD is right now the fastest in the whole WD color spectrum. So if you came to this video, whether you're a gamer or not, and you wanted the fastest SSD, boom, there you are, the SN850X. Again, PCIe Gen 4 arriving at between 1 and 4 TB. Yes, I keep looking at my notes, I'm only human. This SSD with its 1200 terabytes written, so again 0.3 drive writes per day once again. Although it's more expensive at £138 to £655, remember 4TB, or $159 to $699, what you get in return is performance at 7,300 megs read and 6,600 megabytes per second write. A huge jump, again massively dwarfing where we started. And in terms of 4K random IOPS, 1.2 million over 1.1 million. It is the performing SSD, and if you're a gamer that takes things seriously, you will want to consider that SSD. But just bear in mind that if you're a PS5 user, you're not going to be able to take advantage of its performance due to the architecture of the PS5 and the way it's geared towards the 850. We've done numerous tests comparing the 850 and the 850X on PlayStation 5 and saw little to no difference. So if you're a PS5 gamer, save that wedge and get the SN850 with a heatsink. But now let's move on to our next drive, the more domestic, the more familiar, the easygoing, middle of the road WD Blue. Now WD Blue, it's kind of put your feet up time. This is an SSD that for the most part is designed single use deployment in a laptop, day to day, knocking around on the internet. If you've got offices, you know, with lots and lots of PC and terminals there, and you need a nice basic SSD to pop the old operating system on to run nice and fast, or you want something a little bit more, you want to move towards NVMe, you've got a new laptop with an NVMe slot there, but you still don't intend to absolutely burn the system out or play COD 24/7. WD Blue is your everyday, it's your standard, it's your easygoing domestic, it's super domestic class SSD, middle of the road performance, middle of the road energy efficiency, middle of the road through and through. And there's a reason why it's often the most affordable tier in all of the spectrum of WD's portfolio in the colours. Now, if we start this time at the top end, let's start at its highest point there. So at the highest performing SSD is the WD Blue SN750. It's an M2 NVMe SSD PCIe Gen 3 arriving at 250 gig all the way up to 2 TB at 1200 terabytes written, again 0.3 drive writes per day. This drive arriving at £35 in the UK all the way up to £170 in the UK based on that 2 TB model, and $53 to $239. Again, when you look at the numbers we just talked about with the WD Black, it's a lot more affordable. The performance is 3500 over 3500 sequential read-write respectively, and in terms of IOPS performance, it's 360 over 390 100K. So again, reasonable middle ground numbers which provide you with very, very solid, dependable performance, and those IOPS there, although clearly half and in some cases a quarter of what the WD Blacks had, you're not going to be utilising the SSDs anywhere near enough that you're going to need higher IOPS numbers there. But again, that SSD is for everyday PC users that happen to have an M2 NVMe slot. Most home domestic users or people pop it inside a laptop or even a small little case, they're not going to want NVMe. They can't even get NVMe. They're going to stick to SATA. Now, WD Blue, when it comes to SATA, currently, at the time of recording, has two main options. There is the kind of standard middle ground growing SA510 or the WD Blue 3D, but the 3D only really referring to the NAND that's utilised. So let's start with that first one. The SA510 is both a SATA and M2 SSD. Don't get M2 and M2 NVMe all mixed up. M2 is a size of drive, but M2 SATA and M2 NVMe are very different. One gives you around 500 to 600 megs, the other one gives you thousands of megs. But if you don't have the right slot on your PC or Mac, doesn't matter anyway. So the 510, again, in M2 or SATA, arrives at 250 gig up to just 1 TB with a 400 terabytes written rate in it, so slightly lower durability than what we've talked about thus far. £37 up to £81 or $35 up to $99. It's pretty affordable for PC users. On top of that, in terms of IOPS, because it's no longer NVMe, you can ignore the hundreds of thousands. It is 90,000 over 82,000 read-write respectively, and in terms of performance, as it's SATA, despite it being new, SATA SSDs have all peaked now at about 450 to 550 meg across the board, and this drive is no exception at 520 over 510 respective megabytes per second. it's not an exciting SSD, but if the host system you're using for everyday use isn't exciting anyway, who gives a flip? Now, the WD Blue 3D drive, that 3D TLC NAND, this is a SATA 2.5 inch drive. Now, this arrives at 2 TB, that can also go to a 4 TB drive. It's a chunky drive. It's got a 600 terabyte written rating there, which is, fair to middling, pretty much the same drive writes per day. In terms of pricing, is obviously more expensive than one we've talked about, because you're getting something of a performance benefit. Now, that means it arrives, going by my notes there, at £182 to £400, or £179 to $340. $179 to $340. So again, more expensive than the previous drives, but remember it goes up to 4 TB. I hate seagulls. So on top of that, you can talk about the performance. Again, SATA. It does a very good job of oversaturating SAR at 560 megabytes per second over 530, and in IOPS, 95,000 IOPS over 81,000 IOPS. Again, comparable to the 510 we just mentioned, but just more capacity available, better NAND, and an overall better SSD for those that can afford it or have a system that can take advantage of it. Between all of those WD Blue drives, as long as you make the choice between NVMe or SATA, ultimately, it's a very clear-cut choice. If you have an available NVMe slot, go for the SN570. You won't regret it, and the performance benefits and latency decrease alone is justifying of that price. But for now, let's go to somewhere where you want to save a little other saving to make in your host system and day-to-day running with WD Green. Now, WD Green, much like WD Blue, has seen a lot of changes in the portfolio. One of the problems WD has seemingly had with the solutions they have available is that although SSDs change all the time, when it comes to low-level, domestic, really simplified use, there's only a finite of things you can do, and modern technology moves forward and forward and forward to a point where low-powered or low-performance drives end up being either completely uncost-effective to develop or reach a point where they are too comparable to current gen drives as the technology and the gaps between every milestone get smaller and smaller and smaller. That WD drive is designed to be a lot more energy efficient. It's designed to have a lesser impact on the host system and run for an extended period of time with little or no detrimental effect to do with overheating and overpowered use over time to the overall system. WD Green is energy efficiency. In a lot of cases, it is highly comparable to the architecture of a WD Blue drive, but with certain very obvious shortfalls that are reflective of the price. Now let's start with that M2 NVMe version there. Now this arrives the SN350 at a lowly 240 gig up to 2 TB. The drive, in some cases when it comes to the higher 1 and 2 TB capacity units, arrives with QLC NAND rather than TLC, which means you get a lowering of performance at the higher tier you've not seen before, and a lowering in durability, as QLC NAND is quad-layered cell NAND rather than pretty much all the other NAND we've talked about up to this point being TLC or triple layer cell NAND. So with a 100 terabytes written durability, it's not the most high performing lifespan wise SSD in the market. It's really designed for small, low level, low energy operations, certainly not high data refresh rate, something we'll talk about a little later on. It's a PCIe Gen 3 SSD, and often the warranty on WD Green can be lower, in some cases 3 years. Now, for this SSD, they arrive as lowly as £25 up to $125, or in dollars, it's $29 up to $139. In terms of performance, better than you would have expected at 3,200 megabytes per second respective read and write, but depending on the capacity, that can dip to 3,000 in places. In terms of IOPS, it's 500k IOPS over 400k IOPS. So again, despite its rather modest build, the WD Green drive in NVMe clearly does give you quite a lot for its architecture there. Just bear in mind that the durability will not be particularly high, and also a sustained utilization, or the question of memory improvements,
is not really a subject you're going to be able to have handed to you on the WD Green series. Now, WD Green, again, much like the other, like WD Blue, separated between NVMe and SATA, and there is an M2 SATA and 2.5-inch SATA version available. Now, the WD Green Everyday series arrives in between 240 gig and 2 TB, but again, it is SATA, so you're going to see enormous drops in performance overall. That means at £22 to £150 or $29 to $167, the price is probably one of the most affordable on this entire list once you get to the highest capacity. But the performance on the SATA Everyday Green SSDs, it's a bit meh. And unless you're going to use a kind of meh system to start with, don't let this drive be your bottleneck. This is designed to be low level. And if energy efficiency is what you're looking for and sustained utilization over efficiency is what you want, then the 540 megabytes per second over 510 megabytes per second performance on this being in your spectrum should be quite appealing. On top of that, it's 65,000 5 IOPS and 50,000 IOPS read-write respectively. Again, some of the lowest IOPS we've talked about in the video thus far due to the QLC NAND in some cases, and even in the non-QLC models being quite lowly capacity. But if you're not too bothered about IOPS with like caching and databases of regular access for a 24/7 system, where you really are just prioritizing sustained lifespan and not sustained activity, the WD Green Everyday series is probably what you're going to want to go for. Which brings us now moving towards, again, not just the subject of 24/7 utilization, but what if you want 24/7 utilization, but you're also planning on smashing the SSD quite a lot? I give you the WD Red series. Now, the WD Red series is the one that I'm personally the most familiar with, closely with WD Black. These are drives that are designed for network attached storage, or NAS systems, much like Google Cloud and more, but your own private version. These SSDs live inside and can be utilized for a multitude of means. Not only are drives like these utilized for things like caching, when copies of data is moved is copied from the main storage bays and moved onto the SSDs for faster access, but also tiered storage, which combines hard drive and SSD storage into multi-layered multimedia storage pools, or just raw storage. When SSDs are used for caching for larger databases, it means the data that's going on them can be rapidly changed, and therefore the question of sustained performance and sustained durability brings its head round, and that's why the WD Red series arrived on the field of play. It allowed an SSD that, instead of balancing just high performance, this time this drive has got sustained read, write and lifespan very much at the forefront of its architecture, and that goes for energy consumption as well in a 24/7 environment. Now, the older generation of WD Red SSDs was the SATA family, like the one I've just pointed out there, the SA500, arriving in SATA 2.5-inch and an M2 M2 SATA version as well. Now, these arrive at between 500 gig and 4 TB, with a maximum terabytes written of 2,500 there. So again, slightly fractionally higher drive writes per day than the last couple of SSDs we talked about. And certainly when it comes to pricing, you can see that utility has affected the price tag as well. So £56 up to £466 for the larger 4 TB capacity in dollars, 64 to 419. But it's those IOPS at 560 over, read writes, I should say, at 560 over 530, and IOPS at 95 over 85 shows you that the SSD is quite comparable to the likes of the WD Green in some cases in terms of lifespan and durability, not durability, in terms of performance. But at the same time, this is a drive that is designed for that sustained read-write activity. But of course, when WD introduced the WD Red SATA series, most people were wondering when they were going to release an NVMe, because more and more NASs are arriving with M2 NVMe bays on board for caching and for storage. So therefore, having a SATA SSD that caps out at 550 wasn't going to cut it for them. And that's why WD introduced the SN700 red SSD. A PCIe Gen 3 NAS SSD, arriving at between 250 gig for caching needs all the way up to a nice interesting 4 TB. It also arrives with a terabyte written of 5100, leaps ahead. On top of that, this PCIe Gen 3 x 4 SSD arrived on the scene with full NVMe controller on board that we've seen already previously in some of the other newer generation, but at the same time the NAND being used at 3D TLC NAND allowed very, very good performance. Before we get to that, £41 to £466, or £64 to $499, I should say. And then when it came to performance, it was 3,400 megabytes per second over 300, and 550,000 IOPS over 560,000 IOPS. An enormous jump from what we saw of those SATA drives over there. And again, bear in mind, these are drives that are designed for sustained utilization and operation there, more so than a lot of the SSDs we've talked about. Now, you could just stick in a couple of WD SSD blacks that we talked about earlier on, which are designed for gaming, which is great, but they don't have the same durability factor in some capacities there. And also scaling wise, you'd end up overspending substantially for a PCIe Gen 4 SSD when very few NASs are Gen 4 at the moment. So going for the WD Red SSD makes sense in a number of different ways, and you can see why WD went there. So before we wrap the video up, we've got one SSD color left to go through, but it is the one that is again on the cusp of enterprise while still remaining in the color spectrum, and that is of course WD Gold. Now the WD Gold SSD is NVMe, but with a twist. It is U.2. This is taking advantage of the high performance of M2 NVMe kind of standard, but has a larger area of space like a SATA 2.5 inch SSD in order to add more components and chips. The result is much higher capacity without having to water down the NAND towards QLC. Now to put that into perspective, they start at 960 gig and go up to 7.68 terabytes. Now you might be thinking, why the weird numbers? Why not just flat out terabytes and gigabytes? That's because these SSDs, which are massively designed for data center utilization, by the way, more so than the red that we mentioned earlier on and the green in terms of efficiency, these are for high performance, sustained utilization for days, weeks, months, or even years at a time. This SSD takes advantage of over provisioning natively. That is, an area of the SSD is kind of reserved for system performance to help as a buffer there. That's why instead of 1 TB, it's 960 gig. So the 7.68 TB is really an 8 TB drive with over provisioning factored in. It's a PCIe Gen 3 SSD, although there are Gen 4 SSDs out there. They move outside of the color spectrum. And there's also an enhanced durability there of a staggering 0.8 drive writes per day. To put that into perspective, that means this SSD, for every 1 terabyte, you can write 800 gig to it and delete and write every single day, and it will still run fine for the allotted period. There'll be no durability problems throughout. On top of that, pricing, as you would imagine, is pretty steep, starting at $399 and going up to £1,599. In terms of dollars, we are talking $280, which is quite conventional, but remember, think about the tax, all the way up to $1,700. These are serious SSDs and serious in their performance, but they're still Gen 3, which means you're only going to get 3,100, I say only, you're going to get 3,100 megabytes per second read and close to 2,500 megabytes per second write. But in the conventional performance measures in the middle and the capacity, it's around 2,000. In terms of IOPS, it's 472,000 over just 65,000. These are SSDs that are certainly prioritizing one thing over another. And in terms of data center utilization, if you are going to be running high AI powered operations, if you have high level databases that are going to be accessed by lots of people, a little bit more in the read capacity than the write capacity, then the WD Gold series, particularly you're going to have to look at the flash servers that are going to need high-end CPUs in order to provide the horsepower for the bandwidth to actually do its job, then the WD Gold series might be for you. But that's really it. In 2022, those are the WD colours. The WD Black, the WD Blue, the WD Green, which I'm not convinced will be around for much longer, WD Red, and WD Gold. Now again, check out the beginning of the video when I talked about honourable mentions. There are other SSDs out there, and perhaps you'd like to see a guide on other drives out there where we'll be looking at other storage media from other brands as well very, very soon. But thank you so much for watching my guide to buying the right WD Colors SSD for your needs. I hope you found this helpful. There should be an updated article in the description. There's also links to where you can get hold of the SSDs in today's video below. And if you were planning on shopping at Amazon anyway, why not use those links? You can shop anywhere you want, of course, you're a human being entitled, but if you were going to go to Amazon, please use the links. We get a kickback, it costs you nothing extra, and it allows us to keep doing what we do, me and Eddie here at NAS Compares. If you need help with your decision, use the free advice section over on NAS Compares, linked in the description, or the free community forum, Ask NAS Compares. Other than that, have yourself a great week, and I'll see you on the next video.